Hi, I'm David Hatcher Childress. I am an author, an archaeologist, and a researcher. I've written over 20 books during the past 30 years, including my popular Lost Cities series of books and this book, Extraterrestrial Archaeology. When this book first came out in the early 1990s, I went to Australia to promote the book, and the video that you are about to watch was created at that time. Since the creation of this video, the book has gone through several new editions, including a number of foreign editions. One of the things that I talk about in this video is the Blair Cuspids, a series of obelisks that were photographed.
Hi, welcome to the world of extraterrestrial archaeology. My name is David Hatcher Childress, and I'm actually an archaeologist. I travel around the world in search of lost cities and ancient mysteries. But recently, my attention has been turned to outer space, off our planet, and therefore extraterrestrial. But I've looked for anomalies, unusual features, pyramids, obelisks, other important features on our moon and Mars, Venus and Mercury, and the moons of outer planets too. So join me as we search for extraterrestrial archaeology. The moon itself, the more you research the moon, the more I did. I was able to quote people a lot more expert in the subject than me who said, the more you know about the moon, the more far out and amazing it gets, and the less you really know. And even after NASA went to the moon and brought back all this information, they didn't know anything more about the moon in a sense. The moon just became more and more puzzling. One of the things we always know about the moon is that the moon, as it goes around the Earth, always keeps one face toward us. And we can never see the dark side of the moon. Now, this is a little bit unusual. I mean, it's obviously in a very special orbit around our planet for it to do that. Even more amazing is that when we have a total eclipse of the sun by the moon, and the ancient peoples like the Egyptians and the Mayans, and no doubt the Chaldeans, other people, the Indians, everybody who was very much into astronomy, on other planets and moons too, that their ejecta from the crater does not hold scientifically because it's not like they're being blown out from the center of the crater. All right, this is actually a photo of the Nazca Plain in Peru. And we see how lines, Nazca Plain is famous, unusual lines going helter-skelter, oddball designs written on the plain, other lines going out in various geometric patterns and that kind of thing. Are they related to rays on the moon? Well, maybe or maybe not. There doesn't seem to actually be any purposeful design of the rays that are coming out of the crater. Coming across here and ending right here, this white spot, is a giant vehicle moving on the moon. Something like that, and it's leaving a tractor tread pattern across the moon as it moves. Now, NASA actually even did a whole document study of this thing. It was so strange. They call it a rolling rock on the moon. And there's several of them. I mean, in the appendix of my book is the entire NASA study on these things. One of their rolling rocks, because in one of the photos there's two of them, one of these rolling rocks rolls out of a crater, up and out, and then down. This is another one, and it's moving along. Again, it makes a tread pattern. And the moon crust is full of them. Now, the hypothesis is that these giant mining machines move around on the moon, literally scooping up the moon, processing the metals, throwing waste at one end, and then keeping the compacted rare metals inside. This is actually a Russian mock-up of one of their early lunar rovers that they were going to build, or actually built, to go around on the moon. Here you can see the wheels and treads, that kind of thing. So we see the kind of possible sort of vehicles that might be running around on the moon. On the moon are bottomless craters, literally. Other craters are craters with inside craters. You can see here, this is actually a drawing of what is like a ladder-type object. And the next photo is actually of this crater, going down inside this crater. Now, there are literally craters on the moon they can't find bottoms to. One theory on the moon is that the moon is hollow. Now, when different stages of the Apollo landing module, they would drop rocket stages on the moon when they were done with them, and they would crash onto the moon. And the moon continued to ring like a bell for hours and vibrate. NASA does not like to admit or even speculate that the moon is hollow. By going through the so-called bottomless craters on the moon, you will enter inside it. Now, how would you make a hollow moon? How could a moon like ours be created in that way if it was? And along with all this, and many of the authors on the moon, of the more esoteric books, shall we say, speculated that, yeah, the moon is an artificial spaceship, our moon. And also that maybe other moons are also artificial spaceships too, and they're all hollow. Now, how would you make one of these moons? One way to do it would be you go out to the asteroid belt, get yourself a nice big hunk of asteroid, superheat it with whatever devices you've got, thermonuclear bombs or certain wave weaponry, so you've got like a molten blob of asteroid rock in space, and then just like a glass blower blows a glass ball, you blow yourself a giant hollow moon. And as that moon cools, it will take on a glassy appearance, the whole thing, it's been molten. And you will have dark patches like Maria. You will have cracks, things like that in the moon. And in theory, you're going to want various craters and things like that so that you can come and go from inside the moon. All right, this is the slide with the hollow moon and the bottomless crater, which is this one down here. It's not going to be too, there, that was pretty good. You can actually see at the bottom of this, and George Leonard in his book, Somebody Else is on the Moon, went into quite a bit of detail on this. In this bottomless crater, which I can't find a bottom to, there is then an object, which we had the drawing on the page before, of it going, the ladder, but it's huge, almost like a skyscraper, and you can see it looks like a giant ladder moving down inside this crater. When I started researching about the moon and cities on the moon, objects on the moon, I found that even back to the earliest moon maps and the earliest astronomers, they were all saying that, yeah, there are cities on the moon, there are strange craters full of domed cities and things like that, canals, similar as they believed on Mars. This is what they called a city on the moon. But they drew illustrations, they appeared in all the astronomical journals of the time. Later now they find that the crater, that these structures that they had drawn is even gone. And this became part of the whole story on the moon, is that craters suddenly appear, other craters disappear. One of the had lines going through it and roads and things like that. Finally, eventually, the crater itself disappeared and was just simply not visible anymore. The crater Darwin, which is what these are of. This is a comparison of various illustrations for the crater Darwin. Astronomers constantly looked at this one. It was an easy crater to see, and what they kept mapping was all kinds of different roads and maps and lines crossing the crater. These seem to change constantly. Okay, now on the moon are many what they call riles and rivulets, coming and going from craters. Here we can see a good one here, moving along, this kind of thing. Now, NASA geologists have looked at this and have wondered, okay, what are these things? Are there rivers on the moon? This is what they look like. Their only explanation for these things is that they could be lava flows from the early formation of the moon, or possibly cracks in the moon themselves. Now, a jet propulsion engineer who was of German nationality and moved to Los Angeles, he wrote a book that Adventures Unlimited sells called We Discovered Alien Bases on the Moon. And he actually proposed in his book and provided evidence, and we'll see some more slides coming up, that there's water on the moon, there are rivers on the moon, there's irrigation on the moon, and there's even terraced farming on the moon. And you get into the whole thing, which gets back to Apollo missions, of what it's like on the moon. Whether, can you just get out of your spaceship and start walking on the moon, even breathing the air? According to NASA, you can't. But according to other researchers on the moon, you can. Even the whole gravity of the moon and, again, clouds on the moon, water, atmosphere, is a big question. Astronauts have reported clouds on the moon. Astronomers have reported clouds on the moon, and clouds drifting across craters. Absolutely, the moon is some kind of desert environment that's not at certainly not some lake district or something like that. But there is evidence that certain craters are flooded with water at certain times for irrigation, that there are canals between craters. This is a huge feature called the straight wall, and it starts here, moves right up, and it's perfectly straight, and it's like a giant, huge gap. And it's the way a lot of structures are seen on the moon and Mars and other planets is simply by the shadows that they cast. So this is actually a drawing done of the straight wall, and no one really has a good explanation for what this thing is. It could be a giant, like hangar wall that again goes inside the moon. It's hard to say. No one's ever been able to see the face of this thing. Maybe there isn't one. Other ideas are that when the moon was formed, even as an artificial structure, it was ripped. This is like a big rip in the moon, perfectly straight. Others have also theorized that devastating wars have been fought on the moon, and that, again, the straight wall is part of that. No one really has a good explanation for that. One of the craters which astronomers had for a long time looked at and thought was extremely unusual was the crater Gassendi, which is this one here. Gassendi is on this side of the moon that faces us. And for the last 100 years, this crater in particular has been the focus of what is called transient lunar light phenomenon. So we start to see, I mean, there's a pattern that flows on all this material on the moon of lights on the moon, strange tracks on the moon, rays of this dust streaming out from craters. To this day, even in mainstream astronomy, the whole subject of light phenomena on the moon is well known, and it can't be explained. The traditional explanation would be something to the effect of what's called piezoelectric phenomenon, where plates or rocks there's a pressure on them. Like if you take two crystals or you take a quartz crystal and you put pressure on it, light will be emitted from it. That's more of a traditional explanation of light phenomena on the moon. As I began researching the book on the moon, I found that there were pyramids on the moon. And one of them, the most interesting one I could find, was a crater called Aristelis, which is this crater right here. And on this crater was a little network of about 7 perfectly made pyramids. There are obelisks on the moon too, and other unusual structures like this. One of the slides that we missed earlier was of what's called the Blair cuspids, which are also a series of 7 obelisks standing on the moon with the shadows. This is a photo which, from the Apollo 8, that Fred Steckling, the German who wrote the book Alien Bases on the Moon, what he noticed was that this is the backside of the moon. This is a color photo. The whole backside of the moon is like is all red. He called it autumn colors. He felt that at the time this photo was taken, the whole backside of the moon was covered in vegetation. What he particularly pointed out was right here, 3 lines or terraces, and felt that this was terracing on the moon as part of irrigation projects that were being done on the moon. The moon authors have often claimed that what's going on around the edge of this crater, particularly up here, are clouds. And when you compare the 2 photos together, you see more detail, particularly in this area, in one photo than you do in the other. And it's because, they claim, just crowds are hanging along this edge of this crater rim. Many illustrations and drawings have been done, particularly by British astronomers. In fact, they have a whole club there at Yale and Oxford of these guys who are very good artists and sketch unusual things on the moon. Yale has published a whole volume of these books and illustrations. There's these so-called domes on the moon, which curiously also appear and disappear. If you read the book, even mainstream astronomers get into this mystery. There's a crater called Plato, too, that would have domes in it sometimes. Other times they wouldn't be able to see these domes. I suppose other explanations for this would be somehow why these rounded, eroded hills. There shouldn't be any real erosion on the moon. Allegedly, there's no wind, there's no water. This was a diagram of how I was talking about how the mountains can be created. These are the mountains within a crater, and the pyramid peaks. Just one idea of how they would be created in a natural formation sense. Here we see some other unusual craters, again apparently showing what might be mining activity of a crater within a crater, a bullseye crater. With one crater and then the second one inside. This was actually the cover photo used in Fred Steckling's book about alien bases on the moon. This is a NASA photograph taken from one of the lunar orbiters showing the moon in the background and what is apparently a cigar-shaped, elongated craft moving over the moon. Now these were the same kind of craft that George Leonard claimed were creating the mysterious rays on the moon. As they would lift up, cover with a white dust, move from one crater to another, this dust would drop down, creating the various rays. Moon lights, including a discoid craft coming from the moon. It's a pretty interesting one too, another NASA photo showing an elongated, glowing object on the moon. A kind of mist, cloud is actually coming off it to one side. Maybe even the dust, the white dust that we're talking about, is creating the rays. Howard Menger was another 50s UFO nod and claimed he had been to the moon, that kind of thing. He wrote a book called From Outer Space to the Moon to catch these domes on the moon. It's what it took, because here we can see the whole craters in darkness, and just the sun is at an extremely low angle, and the domes are catching the light. Now, even when we get into what it's like on the moon and the Apollo missions, we find that what NASA's been telling us and what they say it's like on the moon, what they say they did there, even photographs that they say are of the moon and astronauts of the moon, suddenly become into question. And we start to think, well, I mean, we can't really believe what they say. And certainly, I mean, I've found that, I mean, when it comes to what the U.S. government says, what the CIA says, what Senate investigation committees ultimately decide, it's not trustworthy. And in the end, when you look at the Apollo missions, there are some glaring anomalies that they just simply don't address. And they are addressed in a book, which is very hard to get, called Moongate, the NASA military cover-up. It was published by a NASA engineer who worked for NASA. And he came up with some pretty good criticisms of the moon missions and what was really going on. Now, right around the time, just after the moon missions, a number of people, and they, curiously, all NASA employees, or former NASA employees, started publishing these books about the moon, about NASA. One book actually was entitled, "We Never Went to the Moon," and they claimed that the moon missions were entirely fake. So, what people were saying was, well, was not rocket technology. Now, NASA themselves released their own artist drawings of what it was going to be like when they landed on the moon, and this is merely a NASA artist's conception of the lunar module landing on the moon. What's important to notice here is the big rocket plume coming out of the bottom of the lunar module. The module itself is landing in this drawing because it has the legs. This is a photo of the lunar module landing on the moon. Do you see any kind of blast or rocket exhaust coming out of the bottom of it? No, it's not there. Well, maybe it might still be there. But still, there's a problem with what NASA said they did when they went to the moon. And that is, when the lunar module got to the moon, and particularly if this was a rocket-powered vehicle, as it settled on the moon, the moon has dust on it, of course. What it should have created what is called a blast crater. In other words, well, I mean, take a rocket, even a homemade one, and set it up on the Earth and then fire it off. I mean, it's going to create a crater underneath anywhere. I mean, even if you did it on a tarmac road, it would just burn a hole in the road. On the lunar module, and any photo that you can find of the lunar module on the moon, there is no blast crater underneath the module. One of the interesting things, too, and anomalies about the moon, is that the moon is supposedly 4.4 billion years old. Now, at a Swedish university, they began doing tests on what they call cosmic dust. And that is that dust is everywhere in the cosmos, and they've actually come up with a rate that dust settles on the Earth. And every year, so many tons of dust settle on the Earth. And that dust, because we have an atmosphere here, it's washed down into the rivers and into the ocean, and that's where the cosmic dust is, from the Earth. But on the moon, there isn't supposedly wind. There isn't supposed to be water or an atmosphere. Therefore, allegedly, 4.4 billion years of cosmic dust has been gathering on the moon. And according to studies, there should be dust, cosmic dust should be 80 feet deep on the moon, if the moon is 4.4 billion years old. And in fact, the early NASA engineers and people worried about this. They didn't know what it was like on the moon. And they wondered if astronauts would just settle into 80 feet of dust. And the craft just swallowed up. Well, it's clear by the first footprint, supposedly on the moon, there is not 80 feet of dust on the moon. About 2 inches of dust. Now what this might mean is, well, the rate of cosmic dust is somehow just miraculously, exponentially accelerated very quickly. So there's only been 2 inches of dust falling in 4.4 billion years. Or another interesting explanation is that the moon is not 4.4 billion years old, but has only been in orbit around our planet for 20,000 years or 100,000 years or something like that. Another explanation is that there is an atmosphere on the moon and dust blows around, although there would still be a lot of dust on the moon if the moon was that old. Okay, they're setting up the flag on the moon. In some of the film footage that you see of them on the moon, you see the flag actually moving and waving. Again, that's not supposed to be. There's not a wind on the moon, they say. There's no atmosphere there. What they claim, what NASA claims is that, I mean, if you look at this photo, it looks like it is waving. They were supposed to extend a perfectly straight flag. The flag on the moon is supposed to be absolutely straight and square, not like some flapping flag. Their explanation for the appearing to be flapping is that it was a telescopic rod that came out which didn't fully extend, and so therefore you get a fold in the flag and it appears to flap. But in video footage, interestingly, you see the flag actually flapping and moving. Researchers have used this to insinuate that, yeah, there's wind on the moon. There's an atmosphere there. Here we go. Moon rover running around on the moon. You can see dust coming back. Interesting to think that maybe some of the rays and things on the moon are actually created by vehicles. There's an area of the moon, too, where they call these tunnels, and that was these 2 craters called the Messier 1 and 2. And the 2 craters were together. Again, they couldn't find bottoms to either of the craters. They look so similar to each other. Many craters on the moon are extremely sharp craters. Rather than just being a shallow bowl, they're like very deep. And a number of British astronomers proposed that there had to be a tunnel on the moon. And this tunnel went from one crater to another crater. And now, since the mainstream astronomers were saying, well, there are tunnels on the moon, now they had to explain, well, how would a tunnel on the moon be naturally formed? And what they came up with was a meteor strike coming in at a low angle, suddenly striking a mountain on the moon, and literally kind of big pipe kind of machines in a type X formation that processed metals and other things on the moon. He claimed also that there were areas of the moon where you could see these things. Also, were there areas of the moon where there were like bridges and other unusual things, almost like they were stitching the moon. He came up with his theory in his book, Somebody Else is on the Moon, that the moon was being repaired. More of his X-drones coming here. One of the things he claimed that these X-drones did was, this would be in craters, they create a spray coming out of the crater. And in part of the mining operations, here's also one of these X-drones just spraying this dust out of the crater. Again, that might be one of the things about the rays, the mysterious rays with the craters, is that there are areas where the rays are feathered, what they call a feathering of the rays. That George Leonard would probably explain that as having to do something with these drones on the moon that actually spray moon soil out of the crater. More of George Leonard's drawings of giant constructions on the moon. You'll notice that in the book, a lot of the British astronomers, too, that were drawing areas of the moon came up with what were these like cross-type runways or other areas of the moon like this. George Leonard was a very big believer in that just huge areas of the moon are giant pieces of this artificial satellite. The moon would almost be is a spaceship, and maybe in the Star Wars trilogy again, that's what they do in the first episode. In the last episode, they try and do it again. is build what they call the Death Star in space and put it around this planet. It was all over the moon, and then would draw them. And then Yale published them in, Oxford, I should say, published them in this book of drawings of the moon, without comments. Another drawing by Howard Hill and published by Oxford, where there's the crater area of Heraclitus, too, with huge platforms on the moon, other areas where craters seem to be dug out. This area here is like a big angular platform. Fred Steckling points that out in his book, and there's quite a few photos in my book on extraterrestrial archaeology, where what appear to be huge kind of mesas or platforms built out into craters or from the outer edge of a crater going back. These would be apparently just large landing areas that are flat and level for craft to land. It's curious, too, that at Apollo 15, the astronauts went to this rock outcrop, and that was about 8 meters high. And it was very unusual because it was of essentially large blocks of stone fitted together. And if you go to Peru or Bolivia and see the giant ruins, say in the Andes, and these things are all over the world, that's what this lower photo is of, the Sacsayhuaman fortress above Cuzco, you see what are artificial and gigantic walls, 8 meters high or more, that are very similar to walls they've found on the moon. This is, in fact, Mercury. And in my book, too, we're now going to leave the moon. We're sort of winding things up here. We'll go to a few of the other planets. The more you look at Mercury, Mercury is very similar to the moon and has also rayed craters. And we'll see even like some pyramids and things like that. But Mercury seems identical to the moon. And in fact, often if you're shown photographs of Mercury, you would easily confuse them as possibly of our moon. But it's interesting to look at the rayed craters that are on Mercury and on other moons of our solar system, particularly in light of the theories of George Leonard and those of what creates these rays on the moon and other moons too. This is Mercury again, including pyramid-type objects in the center of craters. Up here too. Even some of the craters are like the bullseye craters again. They're a crater, but then they're domed. Even NASA geologists have remarked on the unusual cratering of Mercury. Here, unusual cracks and things like that. This is an unusual photo also of a crater on Mercury of what appears to be two pyramidical peaks in this crater, both casting perfectly triangular shadows in the crater. Right here. Here are the two pyramids, and here's the shadow, and here's another shadow too. Mercury was early on mapped, and with also like the moon, different ray patterns here on Mercury with oddball geometric forms and lines moving around Mercury. Venus too. I mean, supposedly, according to ancient Hindus and other esoteric writing, at least at one point in their history, almost all the planets have been inhabited, or something goes on there. Venus too has been allegedly the site of many different UFO knots. People like George Adamski and others have often claimed that, yeah, these guys were from Venus. Lobsang Rampa, that English so-called Tibetan guy who wrote those Third Eye books and stuff, he claimed in one of his oddball books that he'd been to Venus, and that there was a civilization there, of course. Anyway, the more NASA told us about Venus, I mean, it's an unusual photo. Picture of Venus, what it's like, covered with cloud. I mean, it's quite possible Venus is very much like the Earth, although allegedly higher temperatures. As you go to the outer planets, Saturn and Jupiter, Neptune, Uranus, you also begin, you look at the moons. And this is what I found really fascinating as I became totally absorbed with our own moon. And then as I looked at moons on Saturn and Jupiter, they became just as amazing. Now, one of the things to note here, this is actually a composite photo, but this is a real photo of the moon, the Saturn moon Dion. And that is craters like this and this. And just as interesting is this crater here on this other Saturn moon, Io. Now look at this crater is particularly unusual. If you can see it, it's a huge crater. And the moons are relatively small, too, in these places. Now what I call these craters is umbilical craters. And in many cases of these outer moons, the craters are huge. I mean, and creating what will be an artificial spherical structure. The red deserts of Mars, an ancient planet that once had many oceans and seas, but over the millennia has been drying up. Here we see Mars and the North Polar area all lit up. It was often said that this is an ice cap reflecting the sun, although some people have theorized that Mars is hollow. And here we actually see a hole at the pole at Mars and light shining out. What it's like on Mars, the rocks and rubble. Canyons of Mars. The pictures from outside the Viking explorer of Mars. pharaoh headdress after the metal helmets worn by the ancient engineers of the pyramid electrical distribution system. And we now see that, is it possible that the face on Mars is also wearing a helmet similar to the ancient Egyptian helmet, and one that may have come from the grid engineers of ancient Atlantis? So here we see the face and the city and the ancient pyramid in the Cydonia region of Mars. This is the Martian moon Deimos. Mars has two moons, very small. They are Deimos and Phobos. Curiously, the moons, as they move around of the moon, that you can see some weird dotting or cratering of the surface. The Soviet space probe Phobos 2 got to Mars. It made one orbit around Mars, and as it came back around at its orbit, it photographed this shadow on the surface of Mars. It thought the shadow might be of the Martian moon Phobos, although it's an elongated shadow and could be of a large cigar-shaped aircraft, some sort of tubular spacecraft that was in orbit around Mars. And sure enough, as the Phobos 2 spacecraft turned to photograph the Martian moon Phobos, it took a photo of what appeared to be a long, tubular-shaped craft either coming from or going to the Martian moon Phobos. At this point, the Phobos 2 spacecraft malfunctioned. Some Soviet scientists theorized that the Phobos 2 spacecraft was shot out of orbit after the first orbit of Mars and taking the photograph of the tubular spacecraft coming out behind the Martian moon. This NASA photo of what appears to be an installation on Mars was taken and often used as evidence that some kind of spaceport was on Mars. Notice the bays in this installation that look a little bit like a modern-day airport. That concludes our program tonight on extraterrestrial archaeology. As you can see, there really is evidence for anomalous structures on Mars and our moon, Venus and Mercury, and the outer moons as well. We also see that NASA may be deceiving us in some of the aspects of its space program. Can we really trust everything they tell us? Hopefully we will learn more on this subject of extraterrestrial archaeology. and thank you for joining me on my search tonight.
Well, thanks for joining me on our flight to the moon, Mars, and beyond. I hope that the next time you look up at the night sky in a full moon, you will have a new sense of awe and wonder at the amazing solar system that surrounds our sun. This is David Hatcher Childress saying goodbye and good night.
With NASA, all photos are public domain. And this is one of the things with NASA, is that supposedly NASA is not a military thing. NASA is owned by every citizen of the United States. Everything NASA does, every photograph they've ever taken, every book they've ever published or paper, you should be able to get, and they shouldn't make money off it. Like, all you have to pay for is the cost of duplication of a photo or something like that. And NASA will give you photos, although it's not often easy. And there is a private company in Maryland called Barra King Photo, which is where I got some of the photos from, and they'll also give you photos. It's been claimed by some researchers who get into this that if you order the NASA photo and you order the Barra King photo, the Barra King photos are always sharper and clearer, and you can see a lot more in them than you can from the NASA photos. And that NASA allegedly purposely prints photos to be slightly blurry and hard to see. I actually got a lot of the footage from this by getting books on, you know, astrology and astronomy and the moon. Also, curiously, most of the good books I could find about the moon were not published in the United States, but published in Britain. And many of the photos that I use here they're NASA photos, but they haven't come. You can't get them really in the United States. I actually flew to London at one point to go to bookstores and get books on astronomy and the moon, because I couldn't get those books in the U.S. And I mean, that's what's really amazing about my book, and some of the photos I'm showing you here, is that I didn't take them out of some occult, weirdo, esoteric book about moon conspiracies. I took them from just a normal, you know, British publication about the moon. They're just photos. But the one thing that I found was that these British books weren't pointing out the anomalies in the photos. They would just say, da-da-da, sunset over the moon, NASA photo, this and that. And I would look at it and I'd go, wow, that's an interesting series of 7 pyramids in that crater, or something like that.
Lurking beyond the cold, strange immensity of conquered space, growing and spreading beyond the warped imagination of the greatest human intellect, exploding in unspeakable horror, the green slime. The civilized world at war with alien form, whose slimy touch means instant, horrible death. Invaders from beyond the stars. The Green Slide. Robert Horton. Luciana Paluzzi. Richard Jacob.
You make too many mistakes. You're not right for command.
This is my command, and I'll manage it.
Two men struggle for survival in the infected remains of a diseased universe.
Don't ask any questions.
One woman searches for a last chance to save the human race from the desperate hunger of the Green Slide. A battle in space against faceless beings. A cosmic nightmare that sends you into the incredible, berserk world of...
I would say nobody has anything to fear from us. But we are going to control you now. It is the same spaceship you saw near the moon. That should convince you we do not come from your world. We are here to make you our slaves.
From the laboratories and arsenals of all civilized nations, the most powerful, the newest, the most devastating of weapons blast into action in their effort to destroy all monsters.
What's happening?
What is that, an island?
Hell of a welcome, Commander.
Yeah, but what do we have to welcome them with?
Sure in hell won't have enough. Just 3 rounds. Down!
Atlantis is our continent. Only you can make it possible for us to return to the world we belong to.
Better take the money back.
We have come back to the world that has always been ours. You have no place in it. You cannot defend yourselves.
Come on, come on, come on and get some more! Here's one for nothing!
coming back.